Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. In Season 5, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive.
Vicki Saunders is an entrepreneur, award-winning mentor, advisor to the next generation of changemakers, and leading advocate for entrepreneurship as a way of creating positive transformation in the world. Vicki is founder of #Radical Generosity and SheEO, a global community of radically generous women supporting women-led ventures working on the world's to-do list. Vicki has co-founded and run ventures in Europe, Toronto, and Silicon Valley, and taken a company public on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Vicki has received numerous awards for her work at SheEO, including the UBS Global Visionary in 2020, the YWCA Women of Distinction Award in 2020, the Business Leader of the Year for 2019 by the Toronto Regional Board of Trade, and the 2018 Startup Canada Entrepreneurship Promotion Award. We are so pleased to have Vicki on the program today. It's remarkable the global impact and organization that she has created through SheEO. I remember meeting Vicki when she was just starting the organization close to 8 years ago. And it is truly phenomenal, the impact she's creating both in Canada, but also in many countries around the world. Vicki, how are you doing this afternoon?
Great, thanks, Scott. Good to see you.
Great to see.
/ listen to you. I know no one can tell that we're actually looking at each other.
I agree. Nice to see you through this virtual world. Thanks so much for coming on. You speak a lot about some of the challenges that are facing our society and sort of the rot that exists in our current economic system. 30 years from now, how do you think historians will describe this current moment of global history?
This will be one of those turning points that we see through history. About every 400 years, there is a reboot of what we value. It's happened over and over and over again. And we're at the very, very end of a period of time that started 400 years ago when we all decided that Adam Smith was a genius and self-interest was what people were all about. We just want to pursue our own self-interest. And so we've organized society around individual rights. There is no society. It's all about the individual getting as much as they can. And also this idea of scarcity, that there's not enough for everyone as core elements of our society. And I think we're going to look at this and go, this was the very end. They got to a place where literally 5 people had the same wealth as half the planet. Inequality was off the charts. And they decided that there wasn't enough for everyone. And some people were billionaires. Can you imagine? And trillionaires. What a crazy time. That is not the way to create a strong, equitable society.
It's interesting. I've been reflecting a lot on my own childhood in the 1990s, which in many ways probably was the peak of neoliberalism. And there was so much emphasis on, at least in my kind of community and family, often on like, try to become a billionaire or acquire as much money as possible. And it's interesting, I think, the extent to which millennials, but I would say even more so Gen Z, are really reacting against this kind of framework and trying to redefine the narrative of what constitutes a meaningful life, what is happiness, and what's the kind of society that we want to live in. So related to the previous question, what happens if nothing changes? If we keep on going down this trajectory where there's massive inequality, where our economic systems can continue to be broken, what do you think is going to happen?
We go extinct. There's no way for this to continue. It can't. We have a series of like concurrent, incredibly significant challenges coming our way from climate, from inequality. I mean, people will be rioting in the streets if we don't figure this out. Gated communities will not be safe. We will have like a version of the French Revolution where people rise up. There's just no way for this to continue. And COVID has just been a gift. It's been incredibly challenging, but it's been a gift to get a lot of people to step back. We've seen the inequality in front of us. It's like the curtains have been pulled open. 5 years ago, nobody talked about systems issues. Very, very small number of people talked about systemic barriers and root causes. We were like band-aiding all over the place and asking all the wrong questions. In the last 18 months, there's been a real shift in the kind of questions that are getting asked. How do we get out of this cycle? How do we break this cycle? And it's beautiful to see the younger generation in particular just saying, enough of this, it's too much.
How do we get out of this system? Kind of given that these huge social challenges we have, and I think challenges to the very nature of like the structure of our society, what is the path forward? How do we end this kind of 400-year cycle that you described?
Well, so the first thing is there isn't one solution. I think that's incredibly important. We are so used to like, what's the bright, shiny object, one moonshot that will shift everything for everyone. And I think that this is a trap that we continue to be conditioned in, that there's like one big global solution for everything. I think this is going to be a series of very small individual experiments in communities in multiple places around the world that is going to show us the way. And I think there's lots of those going on right now. And as long as we believe the lie that we're separate and that there's not enough, the system will stay in place. And as we wake up to the fact that there is enough for everyone, it's just a distribution problem and a values realignment. When we believe that and when we come together in communities, everything will change. And SheEO is a minor example of that. We've been experimenting with that. We've come together, we're sharing our resources in 5 different countries around the world to get capital into the hands of those who have been put to the margins. So their innovations, which are all working on the world's to-do list, get financial capital, but also all of our social capital, our aspirational capital, our navigational capital, all the kinds of capitals that are out there to change the outcomes for them, to unlock their new mindsets and new models that we need to spread around the world. So we've kind of lost our collective imagination. It feels like we're living in a time where most people are incarcerated, and I use that word like intentionally, it's a heavy word. They're incarcerated in a single way of doing things, thinking this is the only way. And there are leaders out there that are starting to really experiment with different ways of being and doing to show that there is another way possible.
Who are some of those leaders that you particularly admire who are pursuing that kind of new way?
There's an organization in New Zealand called Inspiral that's actually global, that's really looking at new structures and new ways of organizing together. They have a great little handbook that you can download for free on the web, and looking at like shared decision making, shared power, the sort of snowflake effect of like this network effect of people organizing in small communities being connected together, and how they share resources and share decision making and share power. So I think that is an interesting group that we've been following. Certainly the work that we're doing at SheEO is very much about this. We're seeing all kinds of new business models emerge that are non-extractive, that literally by scaling, heal the planet. Those are the businesses of the future. And so there's one of those would be Better Packaging. It's based out of New Zealand again, awesome place. Lots of cool experiments going on in New Zealand. So Better Packaging is the first home compostable courier packaging in the world. And you can just, during COVID, our landfills were full before, and now it's just crazy with all of the cardboard boxes everyone's getting everything delivered to in their houses. So they've created this home compostable courier packaging that was in market before COVID. Everything was really growing for them. They were doing incredibly well. And then they decided to go back to the drawing board because it wasn't enough. And now their new product is called Pollastic, Pollastic, pollution and plastic put together. And they are paying a living wage to women in Pacific Islands to take plastic pollution out of the ocean and use it as the raw material for creating their packaging. And then it gets recycled and composted after. So that whole cycle, as they scale, pays people a living wage, cleans up the ocean, and doesn't create more harm. So these are the kinds of things that I think are just, as soon as we have more and more of these examples, these sort of like impact unicorns and other smaller things out there come through, we're going to start to really understand new ways of doing things.
One thing I often think about is some of these really large problems, like climate change, for instance. Entrepreneurs can make an impact in the sense of people who found companies. But one thing I often think about is public problems require public solutions. That in many ways, some of our biggest challenges as society sort of necessitate significant government action. And ultimately, government, at least in a democratic system, is intended to sort of represent the people. So I guess if there was a young person considering how to create a huge amount of impact in society, would you encourage them to be entrepreneurial within the public sector and to harness their talents to really trying to find public solutions to public problems?
Everyone has their own path. That is not my path. And so I'm a person who's here to show new systems and new ways. I am not a believer that you can actually incrementally shift systems. I don't believe it's possible from my own experience. So I would be more like, go reimagine the system, because the challenge within existing systems that we have set up is that they all have incentive models built into them. And unless you change the incentive system, the system's going to, no matter what good intention walks in the door, if the incentives don't change, then you don't create change because there's no incentive in the system to change. So I kind of look at this all from the place of, if there's a problem with the behavior, look at the incentive system. If we don't change the incentive systems, the root causes and systems, then going in and trying to incrementally change things isn't going to do anything.
Daniela Pappy-Thornton, who is the former head of the school center at Oxford, has written about the world doesn't need more social impact. It doesn't need more entrepreneurs. It needs more social impact. And it's the opposite. The world definitely does need more social impact. But one of the things that's kind of got me thinking in the context of Venture for Canada, where initially we were really focused on launching entrepreneurs, so people founding kind of companies, and over time focus a little bit more on this concept of like entrepreneurial leadership, so the ability to identify and act upon opportunities to create value for others. Do you think sometimes there's too much emphasis on people just launching new ventures or companies, and it's that not everyone should be an entrepreneur, and that instead there's many ways for many people, perhaps a different path, and a path that fits more with their interests, is to be entrepreneurial in the sense of an adjective of being able to identify and act upon opportunities?
There's a really brilliant activist who once said, the biggest problem in the world are solutions, which I love. It's because there's all these unintended consequences that come when you try and quote unquote solve a problem. So coming at it from the problem state. And so, yeah, I mean, I really do agree that there are multiple different forms of leadership needed, and not everyone can or should or will be an entrepreneur. It's a hot thing right now. And it wasn't a hot thing when I was a kid. It was like, that was what people did who couldn't get jobs. They became entrepreneurs. Right now it's really different, and it's like a hot thing. But the big challenge that I see around this is that we don't really understand the systems we're living in. We don't really understand the entanglement. It's more than interconnection. It's entangled. Everything is entangled. And we haven't yet become really skilled at the in-betweens. We're very good at identifying silos of problems, pulling them out of context and going and solving them. But those things are then attached to and connected to other things. And so we've taken the SDGs, for example, 17 different silos, but the answer to the SDGs is between each of them, not individually. So first of all, I love any energy that's coming to bring their leadership and their gifts to challenges that we see out there. I think if you see something in the world as a problem, as something that could be done better, that's yours. Go take that and lead. And getting people activated is absolutely critical for where we're going. So that experimentation and trying things and then going, oh, dead end, I just hit another trap in the system, because there's lots of traps out there. And experimenting with that is really, really powerful. And I'm so excited that so many people want to do that. And a lot of our challenges are really at the root systems level. And so that's like a way bigger thing to try and like unravel and figure out.
There's a wonderful initiative that's run by the same school center that I mentioned called Map the System, which in Canada is facilitated by the McConnell Foundation, where it's kind of challenging this premise of business model kind of competitions or business plan competitions, and which traditionally for kind of listeners would be, okay, write up a business plan and pitch it to a bunch of judges, and then they say what business plan works the best. The Map the System competition is quite intriguing, where what they do is they get a group of students to map the system behind an overarching problem. And in essence, a group of judges will assess the map of the system and really looking at to what extent the team has identified what are the root causes, what are the main things that are actually causing this problem. rather than the sort of quick fix. And by the way, for listeners who aren't versed in kind of systems change theory, an example, the probably most common example of this is around homelessness. Like often homeless shelters, which serve a really important social need, can be a quick fix. Like if policymakers just focus on homeless shelters as a way to address homelessness, it's not addressing root causes, which is like, substance abuse, poverty, domestic violence, discrimination against LGBT people, so many different kind of causes. So it's interesting, this kind of premise of thinking more on the sort of systems level rather than kind of on the quick fix level. And I think the point that you mentioned is there's been a huge shift in the last couple of years, Vicki, in getting people to think more about systems rather than just kind of thinking about quick fix solutions. So on the topic of systems, one thing that I've noticed in some other interviews you've spoken extensively on is about venture capital and a lot of criticism about venture capital. What do you think are the principal issues with the venture capital system?
Yeah, so it's fundamentally broken. It's built on this idea that we throw money to 10 ideas and one of them should become a unicorn. So like if you're talking about $1 million, like you throw $1 million at 10 things, so like $10 million out in the market, we push like crazy to get you grow as fast as possible, to get as much traction as possible. So you either fail or start to like take over markets, and lots more than $1 million. And it's winner takes all is what venture capital has really become, right? Go big or go home, fail quickly. And that to me is like a deeply capital inefficient model. I think if we were starting over again, we'd never do something like that. And it has the big challenge around all of this go big or go home, is there's literally no proof that go big is good for society. It might be good for the billionaires to get more money and become trillionaires. And it's essentially a way for people with a lot of capital to get young, hungry people to work their butts off and eat ramen so that they can make money for the rich person. It's like radically, it is like modern day slavery from my perspective, just to be super radical about it. And most of these companies that do well create a ton more inequality in the world. So they're actually creating more harm than good in most cases. And so we haven't really seen, kind of like we call them unicorns, but we haven't really seen sort of impact unicorns, the ones that I guess as they scale, heal the planet. And a lot of that reason is because capital comes in with power over the entrepreneur and the innovator and sets milestones on them based on what we've done in the past, which means we get more of the same, what we've done before. And it doesn't create freedom or space for an entrepreneur to totally rethink our systems and to disrupt our systems necessarily. I know they use that word, but most of the capital is to create more of the same. Airbnb for cats, ... right? You're trying to get in a sentence, a simple thing, use a model that's worked and execute. And so that's part of it. Almost all of our venture capital is one of the worst culprits, but there are lots of other forms of financing that are just to create more inequality.
I recently read Innovation in Real Places by Dan Bresnitz, which is a great book, which we talk about for our listeners on another podcast episode with Annette Verschuren. And one of the things he theorizes in the book, he's an Israeli-Canadian academic, Israel has more companies on the NASDAQ than any country except for the United States, which is remarkable considering it's like there's only 9 million people. And often there's been famous book called Startup Nation talking about Israel's like tremendous entrepreneurial success, in particular as it relates to venture capital. But as Dan Bresnitz writes in this book, Israel is one of the most unequal societies in the world. And arguably the greatest political issue in Israel is not the occupation. Within Israeli politics, the biggest issue is actually income inequality. Arguably 10 years ago, there was huge protests. They were called the tent protests. And the point being, and the reason I mentioned Israel as an example is I think Israel's a microcosm of, okay, what happens when a country is incredibly successful with the venture capital model, in air quotes. In the sense of creating a huge amount of economic wealth, but that economic wealth is ultimately flowing to a very narrow group of people. And that's for a variety of reasons. One being that many of these companies employ very few people. So when there's an exit, the money goes to not that many of the people and often just a subset of a small group of employees. The other thing is that who actually owns, and this was even the case of Shopify in Canada, which is a tremendous, entrepreneurial success. But 43% of the stock when Shopify went public was held by American venture capitalists. So it's interesting from an economic development standpoint of, okay, how do you create inclusive wealth and prosperity? Yes, big companies like Shopify create a lot of wealth and arguably, benefit for a country. But focusing just on this sort of mini Silicon Valley model of venture capital fueled growth doesn't create a kind of inclusive prosperity. So on this kind of model of not just identifying problems but solutions, like what do you think is a antidote or an alternative for a venture capital model, specifically focusing on companies that are very high risk that traditional lenders like banks won't lend to? How should these what's an alternative model to finance these very high risk kinds of ventures?
Well, first of all, 99.7% of the Canadian economy is small and medium-sized business. Venture capital takes up all the air, and it is again here today, right? It takes up all the air in conversations, but it's only for like 0.001% of companies out there. But it's become such a strong narrative that that's how you fund companies to be successful, that literally people who have consulting companies are saying to me, how do I raise money? I'm like, go get a customer. Go get a client. Like, what do you mean go raise money? You don't need to raise money. You're like a workshop-based organization. So we're very out of balance with this crazy marketing narrative of everyone become the next trillionaire, which has no basis in reality and people aren't seeing behind. So the big issue is, like in Canada, venture capital has become all the things. Government's in the business of venture capital now. It's crazy. Why is government in this business? This is high risk, private capital taking big risks. We should not be using taxpayer money to do this kind of stuff from my perspective. And so it's really this is why we picked loans at SheEO and debt-based financing, because 99.7% of businesses need loans, and actually good, flexible payment terms, better interest rate. We're almost at a 0% interest rate world. So lower interest rates than occur out there. There's a huge opportunity to be using capital differently, but everyone is just so obsessed with finding the next unicorn that we think it's the answer to everything. And it's become a global phenomenon and a really big challenge.
But on the topic of SheEO, which you've alluded to, and I mentioned in the bio that you're the founder and CEO of, can you describe in a little bit more detail, what is SheEO's model and how does SheEO's model create the social impact that the world needs?
Sure. So our model is meant to run at a country level. So hundreds of women in Canada, I'll just use Canada example, but hundreds of women in a country are contributing $92 a month. They come into this community of radically generous women. We call the whole thing radical generosity. So you're coming into this community, you're contributing your capital. A percentage of that capital is going into a pool to fund ventures. Entrepreneurs apply. They're majority woman-owned or non-binary. That's been a new addition in the last couple of years. So majority women or non-binary owned. And again, of course, led by women or non-binary, revenue generating between 50K and $2 million in revenue in the country that you're operating in the year that you apply, and working on what we call the world's to-do list, able to articulate how you've got a new model or a new mindset working on a critical global priority. And what happens in our community is people apply, activators come in and they contribute this money, ventures apply, and then all of us go online and vote for where the money should go this year in each country. No pitch decks, no attachments, no jargon. We don't waste entrepreneurs' time asking a million questions we're not going to use. We don't have a complex algorithm trying to decide what has the greatest market potential. We trust the intuition of the hundreds of women who've contributed capital to pick the things that they're most excited about.
What are some SheEO ventures that you particularly admire and why?
All of them. I'm so excited by all of them. And it's, one of the things that's so interesting, Scott, about this model, there's a lot of deconditioning that we all need to do. When this first started, people were like, what? Everyone's going to be able to vote? What about people that don't know a ton about business? And I'm like, women make 80% of purchasing decisions. If you come into this and you're passionate about a company and you decide that you want them to be in market, all of a sudden that company gets hundreds of new customers, which is a game changer for them. So it's really interesting as you go through this process. And so I'll just start with this year. So this year we funded venture called gotcare.ca, run by Chenny, who is incredible. And it is home healthcare, innovation around home healthcare. So you're at home, you're at aging population, healthcare issues, et cetera. You can't get out of the home and you need a healthcare worker to come to you. Chenny's got a tech platform that matches up healthcare workers. She pays 30% more than healthcare workers are currently paid to go into the home, and she charges the customer 30% less. And her goal is to provide home healthcare at cost with a tiny little margin for the platform development. That is growing. She's just unbelievable what she's doing with this business. And so the care economy, as we know, is huge. This is a very, very big opportunity. And she's doing really well. She just raised another round with a whole bunch of activators who have invested in her now because we got in relationship with her, saw her execute. She's incredible. And then people are like, how can I invest? This is amazing. And so we're unlocking capital from the women in our community to do follow-on funding.
Chenny is remarkable. Small world. I also know Chenny, and she's really a fantastic person, and that's such an important need. And as you mentioned, home healthcare is, given our aging population in Canada, is just going to become increasingly more and more important. One country that has certainly been talked about a little bit through this interview is New Zealand. On this topic, Vicki, what do you think are some of the principal lessons that other countries in the world, and in particular Canada, can learn from New Zealand?
Well, New Zealand is unique because it's small, first of all, and it's on an island. And so they have a practiced muscle that we don't have of sustainability and caring for, like, they're all in the same team. So there's a very community orientation in New Zealand. And one of the most incredible things about New Zealand, of course, are the Maori people. And so the indigenous culture, many Kiwis speak Māori, and understand the culture of indigenous societies and how they operate is like incepted into the country these days. And so a lot of the mindset that Māori have around living in harmony with nature, how they talk about doing business, is very different than the way that we're doing business in the rest of the world. And that is into the water supply there, which I think is really powerful. This is one of the things we've really learned about during our time. I personally have just been a huge student of is Indigenous wisdom and culture and what it can teach us for how we can actually live in harmony together. And so one of the first places I learned about this was when I went to New Zealand a few years ago. Can't remember exactly the year, everything's a blur. When we were getting started, I was invited to speak and see if the model would resonate locally. And before I could walk into the room to share the SheEO model, Maori elders charged the room and asked for permission from the elders for me to come in. And I remember being on stage when they did their ceremony, and I burst into tears. I was like, oh my God, this is just overwhelming to ask for permission to ideas to come, and if there's space for it. Very, very special. And I learned then, as we talked about this, they translated radical generosity into Māori. And they said, we have a word for that. It's how we actually organize our economy. And it's called kaitakitanga. And I was just like, yeah, anyway, I'm so in love with New Zealand and Māori folks. And they've then led me to learn so much more about Indigenous culture in Canada and also Aboriginal culture in Australia.
I think for Canadians to learn about New Zealand, and there's so many in many ways, lots of similarities, although lots of differences between Canada and New Zealand in the sense that we're both settler societies. We're both similar colonial, but at the same time, a little bit different colonial histories. And I agree. I think that there's been far more a sort of indigenization of New Zealand culture kind of in general than in Canada. That being said, I think we'd also be remiss to say is that New Zealand is far from a utopia, and definitely, and I know not to say that we're saying that, but just for our listeners, that there's definitely issues in New Zealand as well. Maori and Pacific Islander people are significantly overrepresented in terms of incarceration, There is income inequality between Pakeha or white New Zealanders and Maori and Pacific Islanders. There's certainly racism and discrimination that exists in New Zealand, and New Zealanders have said that. So all that to say is the caveat is New Zealand, nowhere is perfect in the world. New Zealand definitely has its own issues. That being said, I think what Vicki was saying is also on the mark, that there's a lot that we can learn as a society. New Zealand's not perfect, but they're doing a lot right. And they're doing a lot right also in terms of sustainability and respecting the environment. Earlier this week, Vicki, we interviewed Tabitha Bull, who is the president and CEO of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. And in that discussion, Tabitha spoke about the 7th generation principles and the importance of long-term kind of thinking. What do you think the world and current entrepreneurs can learn from the 7th generation principle?
So much. Go learn it, right? Like the long-term thinking is just a huge thing. And so, we have this immediate, like right now, I have to have all of this stuff. We don't think forward to how will this impact the next generation? And that's very problematic, especially how people are mostly running businesses. They're not thinking about the sustainability and longevity long-term. Maybe you've interviewed Heather Payne through your time, but Heather just gave back all our venture capital and decided to create an evergreen company that's going to last for 100 years, that's employee owned. These are the ways of the future, right? And they were the ways of the past, but they're getting modernized.
Kind of shifting a little bit to your own personal life and kind of career narrative. One of the things I found fascinating in reading and kind of doing a little bit of research on you is that you grew up on a farm, from what I could tell, in near Ottawa. I think in the Ottawa Valley. And one of the things I've often asked people on the show is how their early lives impacts their later kind of entrepreneurial pursuit. So how did growing up like on a farm near Ottawa in this kind of more agricultural type environment impact the way you view the world and the way you view entrepreneurship?
Well, when I was growing up there, so first of all, I was woken up most mornings with a knock on my door at 5:30 from my dad saying, "Weeding, let's go outside." And so we had like 15 minutes to eat our breakfast and be out in the field to go weeding. But one of the things that was interesting about that whole experience, so being on a farm, you're obviously like super connected to nature. You do all this hard work and then a hailstorm comes in and knocks out all the strawberries and like you don't have any income. Boom. There's like the reality of uncertainty is something I grew up in. And my parents both had full-time jobs, but did all the farm stuff on the side. And so had a bit of both, like had sort of the stability of things, but also this experimental ground. And my dad is an incredible innovator, was always coming up with crazy ideas. And my mother was like the organizer of getting the crazy ideas done. So I have a bit of both of them in me. But we grew up with a lot of experimentation and failure that was never called failure. We'd sit at the table and be like, what do you think we should do next here? And we'd all talk about it and brainstorm. And the next day we'd go build it. And then we'd see if customers liked it or not. And if they didn't, we'd go iterate. And it was constant, like the word failure was never a thing. It was always just experiment, try things, iterate, put up a barn. Oh, my grandfather would come along. That looks a little crooked. Is there something, did someone measure this? And of course my dad didn't measure it. And so we'd like take the building down and start again. All like my whole childhood was experiment, try things, just go for it.
It's really interesting. I think the extent to which growing up in that kind of farm or agricultural type of environment can shape one's career path and personal life. We recently interviewed Annette Fisher like a week ago, and she grew up on a rural dairy farm in Cape Breton, and she speaks a lot about that same. And one thing that in particular kind of struck me that what she said and you said was the impact of uncertainty. In her case, her father almost died of a severe heart attack when she was a teenager, and there were all these other hugely uncertain things. She was in a car that was hit by a train, and really, in her describing her childhood, and I think similarity to what you is uncertainty was something that was like omnipresent, and you can't escape, and it just exists. And we're talking now in the midst of the month like 19 of a global pandemic. In many ways, the world seems more uncertain than it ever was. And to your point, that we're on this like 400-year kind of cliff of who knows what's going to happen. I think one of the most like important skills that a young person can develop is the ability to cope and thrive on uncertainty. And I do think that to some extent, it's an intellectual muscle that can be developed over time. Vicki, we have covered a really wide range of topics, from your agricultural upbringing near Ottawa and how that impacted who you became as an entrepreneur, to at a really broad level, some of the socioeconomic challenges that we're facing as a society in terms of income inequality and challenges with venture capital and challenges with the sort of very nature of our society. And also about the great work that you're doing at SheEO, supporting women and non-binary led ventures around the world, and the fantastic work that your organization does. I really recommend that our listeners check out and Google SheEO to learn more about the amazing work of the organization. Vicki, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It has been a true pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided, stated by our guests and our host, is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.